Vidhammer Fantasy.
Welcome back to Vidhammer. I'm Spudlow, and in this video we'll be covering my second round matchup at the Darkside Comics Tournament in August of 2012. You can check out the first video in the series here, where I go through my army list and recount my first engagement against the vampire counts. In this round, I'm up against the Ogre Kingdoms, not the matchup I was looking for. Of all the armies that were there at the tournament, this is the one that I knew was going to give me the most trouble. Toughness 4 and large base sizes mean my artillery is going to be very ineffective. Given the speed of ogres, I'm likely only to have a couple of shots to begin with. But let's see how it plays out. The scenario this time is meeting engagement, with extra battle points for having more units in your opponent's deployment zone than he does, and additional objective points for being within 6 inches of terrain elements. I won the roll for board edge and chose the right side of the board. I have to set up my entire army first and roll for each unit to see if it's held in reserves. One of my rocket batteries, the Luminarch, the archers, and the halberdiers all get held in reserve. I'm kicking butt already. I put the war machines on top of the hill, with the spearmen to one side and the greatswords out in front. In retrospect, I should have turtled a lot more than I did. I could have put all of my units as far back into the corner as they could go and waited. That would force a bottleneck right when he was making his charges, and a few small moves from my units could have dictated the charges. He ends up with one ogre unit and a single saber-tusk being held in reserve, and the ones that make it onto the table get as far forward as possible. There's a unit of 4 Mournfang cavalry, one of 12 ogres, and another of 11 iron guts with a butcher. The only thing I've got going my way is the piece of impassable terrain in the center. If it wasn't for that, this game would have been over a lot sooner. The Mournfangs are my biggest fear at this point, but I'm glad he has them set up near my spearmen. I don't care if he completely destroys that unit, as long as it buys me some time and prevents an overrun. As if things aren't bad enough, he steals the first turn and brings on his reinforcements. The only good part was that he brought the ogres in on the narrow edge, so at least there's some time before they show up. He moves up all of his units, and I poop a little, but hope no one noticed. The first magic phase ends up 5-4. Before we start casting spells, we decide to roll and see which ones we have. My Wizard Lord gets Foz Protection, which is a -1 to hit augment, Light of Battle, which rallies a unit and lets them pass leadership tests, Net of Ammontok to hold enemies in place if they fail a strength test, and Banishment, which is a magic missile. His Slaughtermaster ends up with Spine Marrow, which makes the unit stubborn, Toothcracker that increases toughness by 1, Brain Gobbler, which induces a panic check in an enemy unit, and Troll Guts that gives a unit 4+ regeneration. Back to the magic phase, he uses all 5 dice to cast Troll Guts on the Iron Guts at the higher level, so both the Iron Guts and the nearby ogres have the regen save. I use my dice to try and dispel, but fail. So now it's over to my turn. With the board layout, my spearmen can get in front of the Mournfangs, and with the central ogre unit being 4 wide, they won't be able to squeeze past the terrain in the center, so I don't worry about the greatswords being flanked. I square them up toward the Iron Guts and move the spearmen closer, but I should have brought on reinforcements first. With the left ogre unit being held out of action, I deploy all my reserves as close as possible to the Iron Guts. If I can team up on this unit after putting some shooting into it, I might stand a chance. It would have been nice to park my Luminarch behind the greatswords, but that would have gotten in the way of the Hellblasters. I also bring on the second rocket battery off-screen behind the first. Magic is 8 versus 5. I use 2 dice for Foz Protection on the Spearman, and he lets it go. It's not much of a buff, but it might be enough to last an extra round of combat. Then I use 3 dice for Net of Ammontok on the Mournfang. I could have tried this on the Iron Guts, but I actually want to get them into combat. I know I'm going to lose against the Mournfangs, so I want to delay that combat as long as possible, and give my cannons a couple of extra shots at it. If I can weaken the unit, it could take them the whole game to get through the spearmen. Alas, he uses all his dice to dispel. He doesn't have a dispel scroll, so my last 3 dice are uncontested. I use all 3 for light of battle on the spearmen, so even though they're outside the general's range, I know they're not going to run. In retrospect, that wasn't a huge concern since the BSB was in range, so I could have used 2 dice for it and saved a single die for a battle prayer on the greatswords. Still learning with this army. In shooting, the archers shoot for the Sabertusk and get a big nothing. Oh well. The Hellblasters shoot for the Iron Guts. I re-roll a misfire on the first one, but only end up getting 3 wounds. The cannon aims for the Mournfangs and gets 1, but doesn't get through to the Ogres. The rocket battery shoots for the Iron Guts, but misfires. Being the only full shooting round I am likely to get, this doesn't bode well. In turn 2, the camera gets bumped. The Sabertusk tries to charge one of the Hellblasters, but fails. The Iron Guts charge the Greatswords, the Mournfangs charge the Spearmen, and the Ogres declare a charge on the Greatsword's flank, but there isn't enough room to get through. The only good part was that the Sabertusk ended up in a perfect spot for the Halberdiers. Magic ends up 11 versus 6. He uses 6 dice for Troll Guts on the Iron Guts unit, and he gets a high casting value, but he doesn't get Irresistible Force, so I go ahead and use my Dispel Scroll on it, figuring that this is the combat that's going to decide the game. Then he uses 2 dice for Toothcracker, which I dispel with 3 dice. Then 2 dice for Spine Marrow, which I dispel with 3 more. And finally a single die for Brain Gobbler, to make my Luminarch take a panic test, but the spell fails. With no shooting, we jump into combat, where the Mournfangs take out 9 Spearmen and impact hits. The Spearmen don't get any, and they take 10 in normal attacks and 3 more in stomps. More than half of the unit gone in 1 round, so don't expect that to last long. In the other combat, the Greatswords take 4 wounds and impact hits, then I refuse the challenge and send my Warrior Priest to the back. I want to kill the Slaughtermaster, and I'm not going to be able to do that in a challenge. I put 12 normal attacks into him, and with Hatred I end up doing plenty of wounds. He only had 2 wounds left, so I didn't need to use that many, and after the outcome, I wish I'd thought about this more. I didn't mention earlier he used an item that gave him an extra d6 power dice, but he took wounds in the process. The remaining attacks managed to do 13 wounds, and he does 10 in return, and 1 more with stomps. I lost the combat by 1, but stayed steadfast and passed my break test. On my turn, I move the camera back, charge the Sabertusk with the Halberdiers, and turn the archers towards the upper Sabertusk that's just above them. Magic is 9 versus 6. I first used 3 dice for Fa's protection on the Greatswords, then 3 dice for Hammer of Sigmar to let the Greatswords re-roll to wounds, but he dispels it with all of his dice. With no other combat effects remaining, I use the last 3 dice to cast Net of Ammontok on the Ogres. I figure the Mournfangs are probably going to kill the Spearmen outright and reform, so the Ogres might end up with a flank shot on the Greatswords as well. Not much else I could do. In shooting, the archers put a single wound on the Sabertusk, and everything else shoots for the central Ogres, who end up taking 11 wounds altogether. In combat, I start with the Sabertusk battle so I can overrun into the Iron Guts for that combat. The cat claws up 1 halberdier before being reduced to a furball. I make the overrun distance to hit the Iron Guts, and it actually works out as a rear charge, as all the models fall over. In that combat, my BSB accepts a challenge against his unit champion. I'm able to do a single wound and block his only wound that gets through, as if it matters. The halberdiers only do a single wound, then the greatswords do 10, and the Iron Guts only do 4 with the help of Fa's protection. The Iron Guts lose the combat and run, with their banner bearer fading into obscurity. The Iron Guts have to run away from the halberdiers since they have the most ranks, so I'm left with a tough decision. I know I need the points for the unit, so I decide to pursue with both, even though I'm moving into a great position for his flank charges next turn. He runs 9 inches, and neither of my units get enough to catch him. Wah wah. In the Mournfang combat, in an almost epic upset, the spearman only takes 6 wounds, but it's just enough to take away the second rank. Without being steadfast, the spearmen run and get cut down. I was just happy that the Mournfang didn't take a reform out of the whole thing. Good enough, little spearman. On the third turn, the Iron Guts continue to run, but this should have been done after charges, so the Mournfangs shouldn't have been able to charge the cannon. The ending results for the game would have been the same, though. As we play it out, the Ogres pull off a long charge on the Halberdiers, the Mournfang charge the cannon, the Central Ogres charge the flank of the Greatswords, and the Sabertusk charges the archers. The Slaughtermaster was the only caster, so we move back into combat. The Sabertusk takes out an archer before it goes down. The Halberdiers fail their fear check. My BSB dies in a challenge, as the Halberdiers do 3 wounds and take 12 in return. They end up being 1 model short of steadfast. They run and get cut down, but the Ogres fail the overrun distance to the Greatswords by a single inch. In the Greatsword combat, they take 9 and do a single wound. They lose the combat but are stubborn and pass their break test. Going into my final turn, the only thing I can do is try to take out the remnants of the Iron Guts. I move my Luminarch out to give it line of sight and head into magic where it's 7 against 5. I use 3 dice for the Banishment magic missile for 2 wounds. Then I use 2 dice for Light of Battle on the Greatswords, but the spell fails, so I end up with 2 dice for the Luminarch's damage spell, but he has 5 dice to dispel it. I should have used all 4 of my last dice for this and hoped for Irresistible, but with the Halberdiers gone, it wouldn't have made a difference. For shooting, I continue to fire at the Iron Guts, but with no success. The Greatswords die in combat, but the Warrior Priest survives, and a Hellblaster falls to the Mournfang as we call the game. We both ended up with some bonus points, but the Ogres took the victory and played on to the final table in the 3rd round. I nursed my wounds as I spent the next 20 minutes trying to get the spearmen lined up. Thanks for watching this battle report. You can check out the 3rd round video here. Do us a favor and subscribe, like the video if you want to see more, and as always, send us a comment if you have any tactics or matchups you'd like to see. Till next time from the Vidhammer crew, keep fighting.
Figures.